Well, hi everybody and welcome. My name is the Reverend Dr. Don Stouder, and this is another in my series of webinars called Helping Humans Heal. Today we're going to talk about medical ethics. Some people call it bioethics, and it's an area that combines a whole bunch of different disciplines in order to help people make important medical decisions at the bedside. I've been involved with ethics for a long time. I was on a couple of hospital ethics committees in the San Diego area, and I served on the National United Network for Organ Sharing Ethics Committee, where we made policy about organ donation and transplantation. So come on inside my computer where my slides are, and we'll start our presentation. Well, so here we are inside my computer. Welcome to this presentation today called Clinical Bioethics in the 21st Century, an Integral Perspective. And you'll see in a little while why I call it integral, because of some of the other areas of thought out there, especially in philosophy, that I've brought in to help us have our conversation. But essentially we're going to talk about medical ethics at the bedside, how it's done now, and some famous cases we'll talk about, what some ethical principles are, and then some ideas for how maybe we might do clinical ethics a little bit better in the future. This is supposed to be a funny cartoon, but the truth is it says a lot about what is going on right now in the field of medical ethics. Politicians want to tell us what we can and cannot do in terms of decisions we make about our own bodies, and people disagree about things like that. And of course, doctors come along and say, wait a second, I'm the person who's trained, I should be making the decisions. And so often these areas collide, and that's where we end up with medical ethics dilemmas. And so let's talk about a simple definition. Medical ethics, also known as bioethics, is a combination of philosophy, theology, law, and medical humanities on the academic level. And when you're talking about at the bedside or on the clinical level, it's multidisciplinary. Physicians, nurses, various treatment specialists, social workers, chaplains, counselors. Lots of people get involved at the clinical level in healthcare settings like hospitals and nursing homes and hospices. The whole medical ethics movement really traces its way back to early codes of ethics and early philosophers, and probably the most important of all of those is the concept of the Hippocratic Oath, which calls physicians to simply do no harm. No matter what you do, make that your golden rule as a helper. I think that would do us all a lot of good to remember that even today. So before we get into talking about what ethics is and some test cases that have gone to court and things like that, I think we have to put the whole conversation about medical ethics into a very specific context, because the truth is there are lots of things that we pretend don't exist when we talk about medical ethics. When we see people write about ethics or speak about it on television, there's a lot of things we just leave off to the side as if they're these huge elephants in the room. So let's name those things right now before we get started. And I'm only going to name a couple of them. There's a lot more than these. But the first one is the culture of ethical abuse in the United States. For nearly our entire history, one of the largest symbols of white supremacy was the fact that white physicians would experiment on people of color. That's happened since the earliest days of medicine in the United States. It's one of the reasons why especially the black community tends not to trust healthcare providers. We can talk about the ethical insanity of a for-profit healthcare system. There's really nothing in ethics that makes sense when you think it through in a for-profit healthcare system. It simply shouldn't exist. That's not really a political position. It's a pragmatic one. It's the one that would give us the best care for the most people, and that, after all, is a central ethical principle. The next, especially here in America, is the practice of providing futile care. And by that I mean that we will provide treatments to patients and families even when we know that they have no hope of doing any good because patients and families ask for them. A good example is a hospice patient, let's say, who still wants to have CPR done on them if their heart stops. It has no effect other than to prolong an inevitable death. And in the prolongation, it will cause more pain and will leave the person in a worse off place than where they started. And of course, that violates the notion of doing no harm. So that's just one example of the many, many different ways that we provide futile care in America. Probably 70% of the care that gets provided in America's intensive care units could be called futile. That is care that's not going to help anybody in the end. And turns out that takes about 60% of all our Medicare dollars spent in America each year. And then, of course, this lack of basic regional resources and money for healthcare. The quality of the healthcare you get depends completely on where you live in the United States. And so that's a few things that sort of make ethics difficult to talk about. And there's a whole lot more that if we talked about them, you'd probably just get angry. And so I encourage you to do a little research on these things that I call what we can't talk about, and understand why they exist, and where necessary in whatever profession you come from, see if you can't work with people to strategize and make these things a little bit better. Let's take just a second now and hear a little bit about the program for medical ethics and health policy at Baylor College of Medicine, because this is a really good example of the kinds of healthy departments and areas of study that happen in health in hospitals and in academia around the country today.
Two babies born, one with this terrible heart and the other without the functioning brain. And we began the discussion of maybe instead of burying two babies, we could save the life of one with this new technology, even though it meant the death of the other from our action.
DNA is naturally familial. So it tells us something not only about ourselves, but about our kids and our siblings and our parents. And he had 2 adult children at the time. So we raised the issue to him, do you think you should be putting your information out there without getting permission from your adult children?
A Jehovah's Witness adult patient who really was quite treatable, but needed a blood transfusion, which he was refusing.
And they passed a law called Terry's Law that allowed Governor Bush to override the court's decision and to order that the feeding tube be put back in, which he did.
The study showed that the actual surgery was no better than the sham surgery. And so it turned out all this surgery that was being done was of no value.
Doctors have praised a Supreme Court decision to force the parents of a terminally ill child to defy their Jehovah's Witness faith by allowing a blood transfusion.
It never occurred to me that surgical placebo would have this kind of effect.
It's one of our natural rights that we're born with, the right to control the circumstances of one's own death.
Governor Jeb Bush suggested the state could intervene in this emotional case.
We had a situation surrounding Terry Shiva.
What are you saying about how to protect people's privacy on this information? We believe this is sensitive information, and you control who you're sharing your genetic information with.
The field of medicine is evolving at a rapid pace. New technological advancements have unearthed ethical dilemmas, big and small, that affect every human being on the planet. The need to address these pressing issues was more apparent than ever to Dr. Brody when he founded the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine in 1982.
There are legitimate moral reasons on both sides in many cases, and it's very hard to make a judgment. Clearly part of the vision was educating the medical students and the residents. And they began to realize that even if there wasn't a clear answer, there was tremendous benefit from thinking through the issues in a disciplined fashion. This track in medical ethics, it began at the request of the students. And I really felt good about that because it showed that, in fact, we had been successful.
Because of the really solid foundation that Dr. Brody had laid, the center was well positioned to become what it is now, which is one of the largest and fastest growing centers in the country. All of our activities are centered around education, clinical ethics consultation, health policy, research, and community outreach. We're able to take everything that we're doing and translate it directly to our students and to our residents. We have one of the largest clinical ethics consultation programs. We've expanded our research to new emerging technologies like neurotechnologies and to issues around public health ethics and policy. And the research program that I've been able to build around ethical and policy issues in genomics, we've been able to work side by side with the #1 genetics department in the country. So we can really collaborate in a way that enables us to anticipate issues that are on the cutting edge and to address those in a really proactive way. When the media has an ethical question, or the president is dealing with issues that are going to affect all of us, or new programs are developing and they want to know sort of best practice standards for how to get up and running, we can respond rapidly to them and help governments, clinicians, and individuals decide what the right thing to do is.
Of course, the program at Baylor is one of literally dozens around the country now, because the whole concept of medical ethics has become really, really important to healthcare. So medical ethics, in terms of how we practice it at the bedside, really has two birth parents, right? And they end up being on opposite ends of the country. And they're both exemplified by these two books. The Principals School at Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Came up with the book Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And the central thought there, although I'm not going to do this justice, but the central thought there is that cases should be decided based on principles only. And I'm going to talk about what those principles are in a second. The second school, put forward by Al Johnson at the University of Washington in Seattle, said every case has specific details. And so decisions and study around a case should be case-based. We should look at the specifics of a case, not necessarily apply the same principles to every case. And so we'll talk about the difference there in a second. But one of the things that just having this limited perspective around ethics did was everybody in healthcare drank the Kool-Aid. And by that I mean we all went to week-long seminars in D.C. and week-long seminars in Seattle. And I went to one at the Carter Center and at Emory and Atlanta. And so we all go out and we really talk about these principles as if they are the only way to look at ethical disagreements or ethical dilemmas. And for a long time that has driven how ethics gets talked about in a clinical setting. And frankly, it still drives how ethics gets talked about in clinical settings. Let's talk about some famous cases that in a lot of ways have defined how we got to where we are today. And the first one, the one that sort of prompted the creation of ethics committees back in the 70s, was Karen Ann Quinlan. One of the things you're going to hear as we go through, especially these, some of the most famous cases, is the presence of religion and the presence of right to life groups and decision making and how these cases end up going down. So Karen Ann was at a party one night. She was 21 years old. She had some Valium and alcohol and happened to be doing a crash diet that was popular with kids back then. And so she was found outside the house of the party, unconscious and unresponsive. She was taken to the hospital. She was in a coma. After a while, she came out of that coma and was in a persistent vegetative state. That is essentially a person who may appear awake but is unable to do anything for themselves and is unable to interact with their environment. So after a while, her parents recognized that she wasn't going to recover, and they went to ask the hospital to disconnect her respirator because they believed it constituted extraordinary means of prolonging her life. And they were Catholics, and they knew that the Catholic Church supported the idea that you don't need to keep someone alive with extraordinary means. if all it is doing is preventing their death. Of course, the hospital refused because they thought it was going to be murder. It ended up going to the New Jersey Supreme Court eventually, and they, of course, granted the request to withhold the ventilator and said that the right to privacy was broad enough to encompass the parents' request on their daughter's behalf. So interestingly, in Karen Ann's case, the ventilator was removed and she did not die. She continued to breathe. Her parents never sought to have her feeding tube removed, and she lived for several more years on artificial nutrition in a nursing home. So what this case really did was it prompted the creation of ethics committees, these groups that could come together in a hospital setting in a multidisciplinary way and talk through the specifics of different cases. The only case that's ever gone to the United States Supreme Court is the Nancy Kruzan case, and this is the one that helped us define what advanced directives or durable powers of attorney for health care actually are. Nancy's case happened in Missouri, and it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. She was 25 when she lost control of her car driving at night. She had a horrible accident. When the paramedics found her, she had no vital signs, but they went ahead and resuscitated her anyway. She remained in a coma, eventually being diagnosed also in a persistent vegetative state. And in 1988, her parents asked to have the feeding tube removed. The hospital refused to do that without a court order, and off we all went to court. So we went to trial, and then we had appeals, and the issue was, do we require clear and convincing evidence in a case like this, or do we accept a lower standard, the preponderance of the evidence in terms of whether or not we think we know what someone would have wanted? Nancy told people she never wanted to live in a persistent vegetative state, but she never wrote it down, and she never told her parents, and so the Supreme Court ultimately ruled as the first right to life case that in fact it was okay for Missouri's court to require this higher level, this clear and convincing evidence level, before terminating life-supporting treatment. And so from that comes this whole notion of having an advance directive, which, if you have executed correctly, obviously is clear and convincing evidence of what you want. And it's one of the many reasons that we'll talk about why everybody should have an advance directive. The next case I want to talk about briefly is Dax Cowart. He and his dad were horribly burned in Texas in the 1970s. It was a natural gas explosion. He was conscious, burnt over 90% of his body. About the only place that wasn't burnt were the bottom of his feet. Even on the way to the hospital, he started telling people, don't treat me, let me die, let me die. He said that throughout the entire course of his recovery, several amputations, excruciating surgeries and treatments over the period of 2 or 3 years, again and again and again and again, he said, I don't want to be treated. Now, he never had the opportunity to take his case to court. It was the hospital making all these decisions and his doctors making all these decisions for him. So he ended up going to college and getting a law degree and spent his whole law career in Texas and in California talking about how we should allow people to make their own decisions for their treatment and to refuse treatment if they want to. And of course, that concept has eventually been held up by the courts. And then we have the horrible case, heartbreaking and horrible case of Jahi McMath, teenage girl in Oakland, goes in for tonsillectomy, bleeds after the surgery, goes into cardiac arrest. They're unable to revive her for several minutes. When she is revived, she is ultimately declared dead by brain death criteria, by neurological criteria. In California, that's illegal, as it is in all 50 states. That's a legal definition of death. And her mom said, no, we don't want her taken off the ventilator. We believe in the right to life, and as long as her heart is still beating, she should be allowed to live. This went through, again, a number of court hearings and Eventually, a death certificate was issued, and the hospital discharged this girl to the coroner, and the coroner turned her over to mom and dad, to mom, who immediately took her to a state, one of the two states that allows people to be kept alive even if they're brain dead, in this case New Jersey, where she was treated with a ventilator and a feeding tube. And she lived a few more years before she finally died of organ failure, which is typically what happens. But in that whole time, and even still, hospitals, or rather lawyers supported again by right to life groups, are trying to sue for malpractice, and they want her declared alive because under California law, your damages are capped if there's a death, but there's no cap if you are not dead. So that largely drove this tragic case. Marlise Munoz. And as I talk about these cases, let me just stop right now and say that behind every one of these cases are painfully grief-filled moments and decisions and even lives that people have to go on living, right? Whether they're parents or spouses or whoever it happens to be. These are incredibly horrible events and incredibly difficult decisions, and nobody walks away unscathed from a case that goes all the way to high courts or cases that are tried in newspapers, as all of these were. In Marlise's case, she was found unconscious at home by her husband. It looked like she threw a pulmonary embolism. She was also declared brain dead, but she was pregnant. And since Texas has a right to life law that says pregnant women on life support must still carry babies to term, she was kept on life support. Judge ultimately overturned, in fact, the first courtroom this went into, the judge overturned it because she'd been declared dead. And the law, the right to life law that said that women had to be kept on ventilators, even against their will, if they were pregnant, didn't apply to someone who'd been declared dead. And that was the case for Marlise, and so she was removed from the ventilator and immediately died. Immediately stopped breathing. And again, just imagine the pain that goes with something like that. The next one I want to mention is Robert Wendland, which is a California case, and really kind of interesting, but not talked about much because it didn't go any further than the California Supreme Court. But basically, he too is in an accident. He too is in a persistent vegetative state. There was some argument in the court about his level of consciousness or not, but ultimately, doctors told his wife and kids that he wasn't going to improve, and they said, okay, let's take him off the feeding tube and let him die naturally in hospice. Robert's estranged mom, once again with the help of Right to Life groups, stepped in and sued and wanted somebody else named as a conservator, saying that the wife didn't have her husband's best interests in mind. And the wife was ultimately named the conservator, and this went to the Supreme Court, who said that that once again, lacking this higher standard of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, even a wife, even a conservator could not remove someone's feeding tube. And so again, this case highlights the huge need, the immense need for people to have an advance directive. And if you don't get any other message from this presentation today, it's this. Turn off this presentation when it's done and go make sure you have an advance directive done. You can download forms, your neighbors can sign, or you can use a notary. It's a super easy process. Go do it now. And when you're done doing it, make sure that everybody in your family knows that you did it, and everybody in your family knows what your wishes are. I can't stress this enough. Then, of course, there is the mother of all heartbreaking and painful court cases, and that is Terry Shiva. Terry's husband and Terry had a conversation once where he made him promise that if she was ever in an accident or got sick and was quote unquote a vegetable, that she wouldn't be kept alive. And so, of course, the the worst happens, and she does end up in a persistent vegetative state. And her husband does go to have her ventilator and feeding tube removed, and her parents, again with the help of a pro-life Catholic group, try to keep her alive. They manage during a very tense political season to get Governor Bush in Florida and then President Bush to sign laws to even reinsert Terry's feeding tube after courts had ordered that it be removed. In the end, courts ordered that the husband be the one to make decisions for his wife. The feeding tube was removed, and Terry passed away. And I think one of the most touching things about this case is her gravestone, where her husband writes at the very bottom, "I kept my promise." And he worked years and years and years and years to keep his promise. Truly one of the most heartbreaking cases in the history of medical ethics. And so let's talk about what causes conflict in medical ethics cases. And the truth is, there are 4 reasons that often have nothing to do with whether or not there's an ethical disagreement in play. The 4 top reasons why we have disagreements clinically at the bedside and in hospitals: number 1, the treatment is futile, or the hospital has a bad futility policy that doesn't support them saying no to a family who's requesting that they do something that will not help and may in fact harm their loved ones. So futility, or a bad futility policy. The second reason, naturally, is bad communication. That often happens when there are people of different understandings of what's happening and physicians who aren't doing a good job of explaining what's going on. The number 3 issue that comes up is no expressed wishes of the patient, and that gets back to what I said about making sure you do an advance directive and your family knows what you want. And finally, not respecting cultural differences tends to stir up a conflict at the bedside. And of course, our sort of predominant colonial culture, Western culture in America, often forgets to take into account the cultural differences of our patients and the cultural differences of our population. So of course that causes conflict. In terms of the principles that we talk about and their place in ethics, when we talk about bioethical principles, we're really talking about 4 things. Excuse me. I had to have a sip of water. We're talking about respect for autonomy, or people's a right to make decisions about their own health care. That's the importance of autonomy is uniquely American, but it does exist around the world. Non-maleficence simply means we will do no harm. Beneficence means that we will do the best we can to help someone, that we have a duty to do the best that we can to help someone. And distributive justice means that all things being equal, we will fairly distribute our healthcare resources, regardless of someone's ability to pay or any other difference. And all of these things really come down to being a form of utilitarianism, right? We want to maximize the well-being of our population, and so distributive justice comes into play. Now, when we talk about taking those principles to the bedside, or going from principles to practice, now we're talking about the differences I discussed between Georgetown and the University of Washington at Seattle. Principalism is a bit black and white and says we apply all the principles equally to every case. And casuistry, or a case-based approach, says, hey, wait, let's look at particular cases and then see what principles need to be applied. The University of Washington at Seattle program was founded by a guy named Dr. Johnson, Al Johnson, and he developed a tool I'm going to show you in a second called the Johnson Grid, which was a way to integrate principles and case-based information in 4 different areas. And it's designed to be similar to the case presentation training that lots of us who work in healthcare got when we were in school or in our internships. He calls it the Johnson Grid. And so imagine taking a piece of paper and writing a line across it and then straight down the middle. And so you have 4 boxes. Each box carries different information: medical indications, patient preferences, quality of life, and contextual features. So when we talk about medical indications, we consider each medical condition and the proposed treatment, and we ask ourselves some questions. Does it fulfill any of the goals of medicine? Is it going to help? With what likelihood will it help? If it won't help, is it simply futile? Will it not do any help whatsoever? So we address with this idea of medical indications: are we doing the best we can to help this person, and are we causing no harm? Under patient preferences, which really sort of is the most important one in American culture, what does the patient want? And do they have the capacity to decide? And if they don't, who will decide for them? Is there a healthcare directive or a durable power of attorney for healthcare in place? Do their wishes reflect a process that's informed and understood and voluntary? So this addresses the principle of autonomy. Sometimes we have to look at this in terms of the person making decisions for the patient, whether it's a relative or whether it's someone that has been named in an advanced healthcare directive. Are they making decisions that are informed, understood, and voluntary, and are they in the best interest of the patient? Quality of life is not something we usually talk about in a bedside setting if the patient's wishes are known, because usually we're going to cede to the concept of autonomy in those cases. And so we try to describe quality of life in the patient's terms. What's their level of acceptance? If we don't know what they want, what are the views of their care providers and their family about their quality of life, and maybe any statements that the patient might have made in their past about what they considered quality of life to be. And finally, is the quality of life we're talking about less than minimal? And the problem with less than minimal or qualitative futility is that the only time that I can make a judgment that your quality of life is less than minimal, and I can do it objectively, is if you don't have a heartbeat or if you have been diagnosed as being dead by neurological criteria. Short of that, nobody can say what quality of life is for another person. And then in each case, we look at what the contextual features are. Are there social or legal or religious or cultural or economic or institutional issues of the case that can influence our decision making? And have we looked at issues of fairness and justice? And again, have we taken into account the patient's culture and religion? Does that play a part in the decision we're making? So we look at all these things and we use them as tools to help us make recommendations about what course of treatment should happen when there is a conflict in that conversation. So we look at what is the issue, what is at issue, what's the conflict? Does this case look or sound like other ones? Is there a clear precedent that we can go by in helping people decide this case? And what tools or talents can we bring to bear to help resolve the conflict? And I would argue that that's the most important one right there. A good ethicist and a good ethics committee wants to be the folks that can help resolve the conflict. And whatever skills we can bring to the table of doing that, I think are really important. And once again, let's hear what some other voices have to say about their work in the field of medical ethics.
I think as philosophers, we're very invested in what it means to give an account of a good life. And one of the doctors told us this, I think, really wonderful story.
I had a patient several years ago that was admitted for gastrointestinal bleeding. He was on a blood thinner, and he was put on this a few years after he had his heart valve replaced.
And so the doctor went to go check in on the patient, and then the patient was staring out the window, and when the doctor asked them what was wrong, the patient answered that
he'd been lying there thinking about what they had done to him, as in put in this valve, put him on this medicine that he was stuck on for the rest of his life. And the whole time this was going through his head, he was looking out the window and watching the lights up on the hill, blinking. And he got frustrated because
the blinking of the light was out of sync with the ticking of his mechanical valve, and that it was driving him insane.
And then he went on his way, and the surgery was a success, but for him, on some level, the whole thing was a disaster and it was a failure because his life was now different in a way that he never had conceived was possible.
When the path isn't clear for a patient, when principles are in conflict, not so much my job to say, this is the principle that we should be following. It's to help the family or the patient to understand, help them find their good, and then I can unpack that in terms that other people can understand.
Clinical ethics, it focuses on ethical problems that tend to emerge within a hospital setting. My class has nearly half of the students being human physiology majors and biology majors, and on the other hand we have philosophy students that are doing a lot of work in the humanities in general.
One of the biggest criticisms I get about things like medical philosophy is that's not actually how it works. That's not how it's applied. Well, this class kind of takes that into consideration.
Dive in and have this conversation.
I remember there was one meeting where I kind of just had to sit back and be like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong in that kind of thinking that informed consent is what we should strive for as a medical society. And that was directly after a conversation with Dr. Raj Alexander.
Informed consent to me as a hospitalist, a practicing physician, is about getting into partnership with the patient so that they agree to the treatment that you're going to give them. They need to know what those effects are, why you're giving them to them, what the alternatives are, what the risks are, and then ideally they would say, yes, I want you to give me the medicine. Otherwise, it's all one-sided. It needs to be a partnership.
So one of the things that makes this class interesting is definitely the joint relationship between U of O and Peace Health. Being in a classroom on Tuesday, being in a hospital on Thursday, and this partnership with Peace Health wouldn't have happened without the generous time and effort of John Holmes, who's the director of ethics.
I really am passionate about ensuring that students get that opportunity because I just feel it was so important for my development, professionally and personally. And if I can just give even a little bit of that to another student, I've done my job.
John made it possible for myself and for 3 students to be part of an organ harvesting procedure. We found ourselves in the operating room and we have witnessed the ways in which organs are harvested from a patient who was dead by brain criteria.
When you watch someone's chest being opened up and when you watch the main artery of the heart being cut and you see that the heart is still beating and you see that this person is still so much a human.
Part of me as a human felt like, wow, that heart kept going. And I cannot shake that feeling. It reminds to all of us the extent to which we are finite beings.
There are just some times in medicine where things aren't going to go as you expect, and you're going to have to make hard choices. And helping the care team sort that out is really what a clinical bioethicist can do if they do it right and they do it well.
This class has done nothing but surprise me in that I feel like it's made me more passionate about my drive to practice medicine, and it's given me more skills, both rationally and morally, to help me combat difficult aspects of medicine.
It's really important to learn about value debates, and it's equally important to realize how those value debates translate into real life situations.
So we've had a pretty long conversation up to this point, and a lot of concepts have been thrown out there. So you can kind of get a sense of the complicated and serious and thoughtful nature with which a lot of people approach the field of bioethics. It's interesting. It has certainly captivated me over most of my career. There's just so many interesting directions that it goes in. In a hospital setting, all of these things are often done in the context of the hospital's medical ethics committee. This is a cartoon that's supposed to be funny, but it can be pretty true. Make sure everything's done ethically, within reason, of course. We don't want to go too far. I was on the ethics committees of Sharp Healthcare, Grossmont Hospital in East San Diego County, University of California at San Diego, San Diego County Consortium, and finally, maybe the most interesting one was I was on the ethics committee for the National United Network of Organ Sharing, where we set policy on organ donation and transplantation. And one of the things that I noticed and that I'm sure most people notice in almost any committee work, right, is that there are some committees that work well and there's some that don't. And in healthcare, there tends to be some domination. And so I decided to give this some thought, and I took a look at the literature and, of course, at my own experience in ethics committees. And here's what I found. First of all, group process sucks. There's simply no one hardly ever present who's particularly good at making sure that group process is done well. Lawyers and physicians or hospital administrators tend to rule. Other people give their opinions and they're often shouted down. We almost never invite the patient or the family into these meetings. Often a hospital sends just one member of their committee, they may or may not have formal training, off to do a consult, and in those cases only 18% report back to the whole committee. So that means we have a very limited ethical perspective. And often these folks have maybe just read a book, like the ones I showed you earlier, and then they're off doing ethical consults at the bedside. Often these consults lack due process. Often they bring up issues that many rights groups in the United States address. Often we have conflicts of interest that we don't address directly. There's very little research of efficacy of the presence of ethics committees. Almost all determinations of quality of life are subjective, and while there are organizations that have written standards, none of them are binding on any hospital in the United States. So I thought about this and I thought, well, gee, how can we make that better? Is there something that I can bring to the table maybe that might improve this process? And I'm a nerd, as any of my friends will tell you, and so I went straight to my nerd kingdom where I maybe found some good answers. And they came from a guy named Ken Wilber. Now, if you have heard of him, you know that he's an American philosopher, been around for a while. He's a very, very deep thinker and an even deeper writer. He's very, very slow and hard to read. However, he's super interesting to read. And one of the things that he's been trying to do for a really long time is find this integral vision, right? Is there one approach that can combine life and God and the universe and everything, according to him? And so what he came up with was all quadrants, all levels, an integral map. And I don't want you to get all dizzy or faint looking at what's going on in this picture, because there's a lot going on, and we're only going to really address one part of it. But in order to bring his sort of whole picture together, he brings the sort of young archetypes together, and he brings spiral dynamics and ego development stages. These are all theories brought forward by thinkers before him and some current ones, lines of development, states of consciousness. But the one that caught my attention is in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, because I thought to myself, that looks like a Johnson grid. And I wonder if I can use that to expand our vision when we are actually doing ethics consults at the bedside. And so if you look at what Ken Wilber does with that, it really boils down to something very simple, as I'm going to show you in a second. What is it? What do I feel? What do we think? And how does it connect? Those are inner things and those are outer things. We can do those as individuals, but we can also do them as groups, in this case, as a medical ethics committee. So I created this AQAL Integral Bioethics grid. And in my grid, the one I showed you before, the Johnson grid, has a place, but it just stays up there in the upper right. It stays in that objective box, right? So there we look about objective information and objective science. We look at autonomy versus futility. We look at relevant, settled law. We define what the issue is. What is it? And we can use any of the tools that I've previously discussed to do that. Then we'll move over to subjective feelings and empathy and what does psychology and spirituality bring to the table? Purpose, values, calling, quality of life. What do we feel? And in this case, we're also talking about the patient and their family being a part of this conversation. We go down to culture plus worldview. What are the cultural and community values in play within this patient's experience and their family and our experience? How does bioethics in art and media have something to say about this? How about the family's worldview? How about the family's political values? How about the corporate culture of our hospital? How do all these things come to play? What do we think? And then finally, how does it connect? How does it connect to our really dysfunctional healthcare system in the United States? How does it connect to economics and the environment? How does it connect to other ethical theories that medicine really hasn't considered very well, like value ethics and feminist ethics and narrative ethics? How does it connect? What about systems theories and chaos theories? How does this whole case, how does the whole picture connect with the outside? And I would argue that this gives you a much bigger view, a much broader view of what the issue before you really is when it comes down to talking about a clinical ethics dilemma. I would also argue that it gives you a tool for group process that finally allows for safety and inclusivity. What is it? Describe the process, start and stop on time, etc. What do I feel? The patient's the most vulnerable of all present, even when they're not in the room, and that deserves some deference. And everybody deserves to have their opinions, beliefs, and feelings considered. What do we think? We make a commitment to reach consensus. We remember that family and significant others deserve to be heard, regardless of their relationship with the patient. We agree to treat each other with respect and give equal time and not judge what other people say. And finally, how does it connect? We don't act like legal and economic issues don't exist. We don't act like our administrators' concerns shouldn't be heard. We explain the ethical theories that we're using in a way that people can understand, and we do this in the presence of the patient, if possible, and certainly their family. And we remember that society has a claim that hospitals will be run ethically and efficiently. So these two graphs, AQAL, integral bioethics, and group process, I would argue would bring such a richer experience to a hospital's ethics committee, and would bring a richer experience to the process of looking at specific bioethical problems themselves. If that's something that interests you more, I have a published article out there about it. Just do a Google search on integral ethics and my name, Don Stouder, and I'm sure you'll find it. So let's take everything we've heard and let's put it into a clinical case study. And here's our case study. 32-year-old attorney who attempts suicide. He does that by taking Tylenol and Valium. He has acute liver failure. What a lot of people don't know about Valium, or rather Tylenol, is that it might not kill you immediately, but it's going to turn your liver off after a few days. We discover that the reason why he did this is because he had a recent diagnosis of Huntington's disease, which is fatal, and other members of his family had it. The doctors come at his wife and they say, hey, the only way we're going to save your husband is with a transplant, liver transplant. The wife refuses to go on the transplant list. The physician thinks it's euthanasia and calls for the hospital ethics committee to give a consult. Now, I'm not going to tell you how this turned out, because that I'm going to let you decide based on what you've heard already. We see things like a suicide attempt. Turns out he wrote a note on a piece of paper and pinned it to his clothing saying, do not resuscitate, don't try to save me. That's pretty clear and convincing evidence that he doesn't want to live. And his wife hears it, and so she refuses the transplant. But does the doctor really have some say in this matter? Is it really euthanasia? Would a community of people who came together really think that, or would we consider that this was a case when we really should respect the patient's autonomy? Think it through. His age matters. The suicide attempt matters. The medical diagnosis matters. His prognosis of a future death matters. The consideration of his wife and his doctor matters. So my question to you is, what do you think? How do you think this should go? What do you think should happen? If you're watching this on YouTube, I invite you to write down what you think should happen in the comments below. You can also look at policy case studies. These in particular have to do with organ donation. Should all felony inmates be presumed content? We're going to take your organs whether you like it or not when you die. Should we change the rule and allow for more donations to take place before a patient has actually been pronounced dead? Should we have rapid donation after cardiac death for folks who are registered donors? Should there be economic incentives for living donors? Right now there are none. So these were just some questions I pulled together around the issue of organ donation that can be debated through an ethical lens. And so again, in my perspective, it comes down to what is it? How do we define it? How do I feel about it? What do we all think? And then how does it connect with everything else? And that is pretty easy to remember at the end of the day. And again, I would argue it's a really elegant way to look at bioethical issues. So that's my presentation on medical ethics, bioethics. It's a big subject, and I invite you to continue to study it and continue to look at it and continue to consider it and kind of mull it over. What would you want for your life? So let's leave my computer now and go on back into my office. Well, so as you can see, medical ethics takes on a lot of different disciplines and different areas of study and different areas of interest and different areas of practical application. Is all we really did today was touch the surface. I really invite you to use Google and use the other resources at your disposal and study ethics more, because there's so many different areas to look at it through, so many different lenses to look at it through. In the meantime, until next time, my name's Don Stouder, and I'll see you on our next Helping Humans Heal series. Thanks for being here.